Hi, I'm Mayor Kirk Watson here at the City of Austin, and I'm joined today with Kerri Lang, who is the Director of our Department for Budgeting and Governmental Excellence. She is the person that is most responsible for putting all those numbers together to create our budget. And so, what we want to do today is have kind of a casual conversation to talk about that budget, which was presented by you through the city manager. The city manager is the one under our charter who presents a budget to the mayor and council and to the public after a lot of work that goes into it. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But that happened just a few days ago. So what I wanted to start off with was to talk a little bit of background on that.
Okay.
What was presented was a $6.6 billion budget. And of course, that's what always makes all the headlines. But that budget is broken up into a couple of things, really. It's we have a general fund budget, what some of us that have done this a while call the general fund budget, and that's about $1.54 billion in that range. And then the rest of it is made up of enterprises, things like the airport and Austin Energy and things that our city may own that other cities might not even own.
Correct.
Tell us a little bit about how that gets broken up between general fund and enterprise funds and where the money comes for each one of those.
Sure. So, thank you for having me, Mayor,
That's
first of
great.
all. And when you think about the $6.6 billion, it is made up of different funding sources. What we call enterprise departments, they are responsible for making enough revenue to cover their operations. And so it's their rates or their fees that they charge. And so you think about our utilities, they have base rates, they have pass through rates to cover the cost of doing that operation.
And when you say utilities, you're talking about when I flick the lights in my house, Austin Energy is the electric utility. When I turn on the water, Austin Water is our water utility.
Exactly, exactly. And so they are the largest part. They're about 43% of our 6.6 billion total. And then the general fund, which is tax based, so you think about your property taxes, you think about sales tax. Those are the primary funding sources for the general fund. And that's why a lot of the conversation is focused on the general fund during budget deliberations because of that tax base as the revenue source. We do have other enterprise departments that have, again, their rates and fees. So our Austin Resource Recovery, picking up the trash, picking up your recycles, they are funded by the rates that they charge. Our Development Services Department, they are funded by development. I mean, then you think of the airport, as you mentioned, as well as the convention center. And convention center is primarily funded through the hotel occupancy tax, but also they charge fees for having events at their locations.
So let's go back to that general fund for a second then, because you're right. That's when people immediately think of the budget. Even when they hear the 6.6 billion, they think that must be the general fund budget. But the general fund is what we use to pay for those non-enterprise that we just talked about, the things like our parks and policing, and talk a little bit about what gets paid for out of the general fund.
So sure, the general fund is, as you said, it's for the things that are not charged direct rates for. So if you think about your libraries, looking at the central library, that's a couple of blocks down. Your neighborhood libraries, your parks department, which is everything from Barton Springs, Zilker, Deep Eddy Pool, your local recreation center. Those are what's covered with the Parks and Recreation Department. We have a public health department that does health and social services. Um, then we have our housing department, our planning department, our homeless strategy office that works on the overall city response to our neighbors who are homeless. And so there are several departments that are funded through those tax bases.
So all of those types of services, they get funded primarily from property taxes and sales tax.
Correct.
So I want to talk a little bit about that. If we look at the funding, I've heard it said that 100% of the property taxes that are in our general fund, 100% of the property taxes that are in our general fund go to fund four things. What are those four things?
Police, fire, EMS, and municipal quarter is the other piece of the public safety function.
So in essence, when my property taxes, your property taxes, or anybody that lives in the city of Austin pays their property taxes, and it goes into the general fund. All of those property taxes cover just one big thing, and that's public safety.
Correct.
Now, in addition to that, we collect sales tax revenue. When somebody buys something, they pay, when they pay for that, they pay a portion that's a sales tax that then gets distributed to the city.
Right.
And that money, so 100% of property taxes that are in the general fund go to public safety. And I'm told that 70% of the sales tax that's collected goes to those four things, the public safety.
That's correct. About 2/3 of sales tax go to public safety.
So when we talk about the revenue sources for the general fund portion of our budget, the $1.54 billion, 100% of our property taxes and 2/3 of our sales tax revenue goes for just for public safety.
Correct.
And what that means then is it's the other money that is then available to us to pay for things like parks and libraries and public health and things of that nature.
Correct. And that other money, once you get past the rest of sales tax, includes a transfer in from our utilities. That's from Austin Energy and Austin Water.
Tell me why we do that.
We provide, or we have that transfer in because the utilities, if they were privately owned, would have to pay right of way and taxes or returns to their investors. And so this is how those utilities give back to their investors, who is the general fund and the general public.
So a long time ago, Austin made the decision it was going to have its own utility.
Yes.
And so we're what in the world is referred to as a municipally owned utility. And then you have investor-owned utilities, which are those private utilities. But in Austin, we have our municipally owned utility. When it makes money, what we do is, in essence, we pay a dividend to the shareholders.
Correct.
And that dividend is that transfer that comes from Austin Energy over to the general fund to also help pay and fill in some of the gaps if you don't have enough property tax and sales tax to take care of some of the other services that we need.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So when you lay out the budget, when we start talking about taxes and that sort of thing, one of the things that I asked for early in this process was I asked for you to make a forecast of our budget based upon what was referred to as the no new revenue rate. Why don't you explain what the no new revenue rate, what was I up to when I did that?
The no new revenue rate is the tax rate that generates the same amount of revenue that we are receiving in this fiscal year.
So this fiscal year, we're getting a certain amount of money, and the no new revenue rate, which is the language that the state used in the bill that created that, the no new revenue rate says you will set your tax rate essentially so that you get the exact same amount of revenue you had in this year.
Correct. And I think we need to clarify that does not mean that the tax rate will not change. It will allow for it to adjust to get the same amount of revenue totally.
Right.
Yes.
So, but it's what a lot of people think of, or maybe I'm wrong about this. You tell me if I'm wrong. But a lot of people think of the no new revenue rate as the rate you would use if you're not going to raise property taxes this year.
Correct.
And that's because you're going to get the same amount. Now, you all did a forecast based upon the no new revenue rate. Tell me how that looked.
When we looked at the no new revenue rate as our forecast start, it anticipated that we'd have an additional $26 million of a deficit for the general fund, which means, of course, you bring in less revenue, which means you have less money to spend with the ongoing increases that we're seeing with our expenditures.
So to explain that to me a little bit more. So we know we have expenses.
Yes.
You don't provide these services without there being some expense to them.
Correct.
And we know where our revenue sources are with the general fund. We've talked about those. If you had a no new revenue rate, in other words, you're going to collect just as much money as you did last year. Tell me how that ends up creating a hole.
That's a great question. So because the city has expenses and requirements that we have to compare to, we look at how fast our expenses grow each year. And on average, our expenses grow about 3.5, 3.6% each year. And that's base expenses. That's taking care of our health insurance for our employees. That is covering any contractual increases that we're already obligated to. If are any wage increases for employees, that's considered one of our base increases. And so we look at those base costs and say, well, based on those that we have um, no way to reduce them or no way to change them, that will be a 3.6% increase to our cost overall.
So in my daily life and in our constituents' daily lives, the increases they see in their day-to-day costs,
We see them as well. We see them in fuel and fleet maintenance. We see them in the price of the commodities or the things we do to help provide services. We see them in our contracts so that, if we have a contract to provide an additional service or to help us provide a service to our constituents or to our community, those prices naturally increase as well.
So when you do a no new revenue rate, it means it, and it says no new revenue. And that occurs, the no new revenue rate would apply even though there may be an increase in the cost of expenditures through no fault of anybody at the cities. It's just inflation, those sorts of things where the cost of living has gone up.
Correct.
So there's another rate. And the other rate that we talk about a lot, you have the no new revenue rate, but the other one is called the voter approval rate.
Yeah.
Tell me about the voter approval rate.
The voter approval rate is the tax rate that is chosen to allow for us to increase revenue 3.5% over the current year. And so it's a 3.5% increase to allow for new revenue or additional revenue based on properties we have this year to increase by that 3.5% overall.
So you could raise the tax rate enough that it would allow you to bring in 3.5% more revenue than you had in the previous year.
Correct.
It's not a tax increase of 3.5%. It's not a rate increase of 3.5%. It's whatever you can increase that rate based upon property valuations so that you get 3.5% more revenue.
Exactly.
That's not the way it's always been, though, right?
No.
How about that?
There used to be an 8% cap. So in 2019, the state legislature changed the cap to 3.5%. That was implemented in 2021. So before 2021, we would go anywhere from 5 to 7 or 8% in order to cover the cost that we were seeing, the basic cost drivers, and then maybe invest in one or two additional areas as we thought was needed as a city. But with that 3.5%, it reduces our ability to keep up with most of our cost drivers, and it almost eliminates our ability to add new programming for the city.
Tell me what's going on. That's helpful on the property tax part of this. Tell me about the sales tax part of it. What are we seeing with regard to sales tax?
Oh, sales tax. Sales tax.
A very volatile way to fund government.
It's very volatile. It's hard to. It doesn't trend. It is something that is hard to predict what the outcomes are going to be. With it being such a large part of our sales of our overall revenue for the general fund, we're more reliant on it. So we respond to those economic downturns as much as anyone else when it comes to our ability to balance the general fund. Sales tax. For example, right after the pandemic, it rose up to 21%, and then a few years later, it was down to -2%. And so there's just this volatility that makes it hard to balance. And what we've seen is even though we can project our revenue costs, our expenditure costs, very strongly and understand how those expenses are growing because of that volatility in sales tax. That's why many people see, oh, we may be projecting that we're going to be balanced in the next year, and then sales tax, if it falls, then that means that we're going to have a deficit. And so we're relying on that more as that 3.5% property tax rate or property revenue cap has allowed us or hasn't allowed us to make property tax our main lever for funding our new investments.
So while there's more reliance than maybe before on sales tax. That what that means is we're relying more and more on a volatile
Does.
source of revenue.
Yes.
And what's interesting is that if the economy slows, or if we have inflation that causes people to spend less, while that inflation may be a cost driver at the city for the services we're providing, it also may be causing people at home to spend less, buy less, and therefore our sales tax revenue goes down. So there's kind of a potential double whammy of the inflation and expenditure cost going up, but the revenue going down for the same reason.
Exactly.
Um, Tell me what happened. The budget that was put forward, that budget, while we had a forecast for no new revenue, and you've talked about what that would do, the budget, there was also a forecast for the voter approval rate, which is the 3.5%. And before we go on that, the reason it's called the voter approval rate, as I understand it, is because if you go above that 3.5% cap, you have to go to the voters and ask them to approve any increase.
Exactly.
Yeah, and the old 8%, the voters would, if you went above 8%, the voters had to petition in order to have an election and try to roll back that tax. But now it's automatic.
Correct.
Let's go back to the budget that was actually proposed. The budget that you put forward and you explained so well the other day at a work session. That budget was at the voter approval rate, that 3.5% cap.
Yes.
Describe that a little bit. Tell me what that does in terms of that budget.
So, from staff's perspective, the 3.5% cap, because of our expanded growth in our expenses, is the best opportunity for the city to ensure not only in this year but in future years we generate enough revenue to respond to the growth and expenses that we're seeing. So, for example, if we would have proposed a no new revenue rate as part of the budget, that would have reduced what we call our floor revenue, and so any growth on top of that would be lost compared to proposing a 3.5% increase.
I want to ask you to explain that a little bit more because I want to make sure that it's understood. We're doing a budget for this year, and it will be this fiscal year, and everybody understands that. But to be good stewards of tax dollars, it requires you and me and others that are working on this to not just look at that one fiscal year, but look at what happens over the course of the city. You tend to bring us stuff on a 5-year horizon.
Correct.
And the reason for that is because you want us to see whether or not things are going to be stable year after year. Tell me the difference between the no new revenue rate forecast over that 5-year and the voter approval rate that you have recommended in this budget.
Sure. So, at the no new revenue rate, we anticipate that, even at the forecast, actually, we anticipate a $26 million deficit
In the first year.
in the first year. That deficit grew to over $100 million by the fifth year. And so the reason that happens is because of the compounding of the revenue year over year, or the compounding effect of that lost revenue year over year. With the 3.5%, we are balanced at that 3.5%. And we anticipate having a small surplus by the end of the fiscal financial forecast.
I've heard some people say that we're filling a $26 million deficit. Is that the way you see that?
I do not.
Tell me.
The way that I see it is the city manager is charged with presenting a balanced budget. And in doing that he is looking at what revenue we have available and making, in some cases, some very tough decisions on what things we need to reduce or reallocate to make sure that the priorities of the council and the community are filled with the budget that is proposed.
Well, let's talk about that. So in this budget, the recommendation is that there be a 3.5%, there be the voter approval rate, which will get us, the city, if we pass that, would get us 3.5% more property tax revenue than in the previous year. Are there any recommendations on things to be cut?
There are. There are recommendations to make some reductions in our fire department on some overtime costs that we think, based on um, them changing some practices, they can have some savings. There's a recommendation in our parks department to reduce some of their temporary and contractual costs. We have anticipated savings in our public health department. I was looking the other day at what we've done to make adjustments over the last 2 years, and 11 of our 13 general fund departments have had some sort of reduction or elimination over the last 2 years to help us balance the budget. And so there are reductions we have, there are investments that we make.
Well, and we've also had a few efforts that are being made, what I refer to as um, the efficiency, effectiveness, and innovation agenda, where what we've been trying to do is, in recognition that the public feels the pinch right now, is make sure that we're operating as effectively and as efficiently and with as much innovation as we can. Can you talk a little bit about some of those items?
Definitely. In addition to budgeting, my team does
Yes.
process improvements, right? And
That's why
so
we talk about governmental excellence.
that's why we talk about government
Yeah.
excellence. And so part of our charge is to look across the city to identify what we call in shared services. Those are services that you'll see um, usually as support services to allow for the city to provide the services to the public. So you think about your human resources, your budgeting, finance, how we communicate outwardly to not only our community, but how we communicate as a city. And we're looking at all of those services to determine how we can be more efficient in that regard, making sure that we are speaking as one city, that we are operating as one city. And the belief is, once we take a look at that, once we make some adjustments, we'll start seeing some efficiencies in those services. In addition to that, one of the bigger initiatives that is going on is a look at our IT services. A lot of people may have heard it being called One ATS, and that is looking at not only how we provide those IT services, what softwares we use, but also what are we doing to make sure we're not duplicating efforts across the city. And that's a major overhaul that we're looking at internally, but we do anticipate a good amount of savings based on those changes.
What kind of things are we looking at?
We're as far as types, we're looking at initially the number of applications we have. How many software do we have? How many duplicative software or applications are we using, that we can streamline that to one or two to provide the departments with the resources they need? We anticipate the initial savings to be about $5.8 million for our IT department. And we think that can grow based on the reports and the analysis that can be done, that has been done. That can grow as high as 145 million for the city if we implement those savings according to the recommendations.
Yeah, and of course the council has also passed an ordinance calling for a systemic, citywide, all departments independent audit and performance review of all of our operations.
Correct.
Which is an effort also to make sure that what we're doing is we're being effective, we're providing our services the way we want to, the people want us to, we're efficient in the way we go about it, and that we're thinking of new things, we're being innovative, which will make a difference in upcoming budgets.
Yep.
Let's talk about the taxpayer a little bit more. The people that are wanting services and they want us to provide quality services, good services as a city. And there's kind of an inherent tension between being able to provide quality services and what people want and need, and the fact that it costs money.
Right.
That adds to the affordability issues that we have in our city. And of course, I've been pushing the concept of affordability first since I decided to run for this job again. And but there's an inherent natural tension. I've got to have money in order to provide the services. If you want the services, it's going to cost money. So let's talk a little bit about how that impacts folks. first of all, we're not the only jurisdiction. If you live in Austin, Texas, we're not the only jurisdiction that is charging taxes to pay for services.
You're right. We are not the only one. There are five. When you look at your tax bill, you'll see about half of that is coming from your school district, and I know there are a few school districts that cover the city of Austin, but about half is for your school.
So I want to be clear what you just said. If I look at my bill and I look at the total number, about half of that is one jurisdiction,
One jurisdiction.
and it's the school district.
It's the school district. We are about between 23 and 24% of it. So when you look at the city's portion, we have the second largest portion of the tax bill. However, we are also providing a comprehensive service across the entire city. And then you have the Central Health and the Community College. They make up together about 11%. And finally, our partners at Travis County make about 17%.
Yeah. So when you get the tax bill, there are a number of governmental entities providing services that are also seeking revenue to pay for those services.
Yes.
Well, let's talk a little bit about our budget and the one that's been just now been proposed. What is that from a property tax perspective? What does that do as proposed to the typical homeowner?
So our property tax bill, when you look at the typical homeowner, we look at the typical homeowner and ratepayer. So we look at not just your property tax bill, but the rates and fees from, as we mentioned earlier, your utilities. So Austin Energy, Austin Water, our resource recovery. And for the typical homeowner and ratepayer, it's about $346 more a year compared to the current tax bill that you foresee.
So let me say that back to you. When I turn on the lights at my house, that I'm getting charged for that electricity.
Yep.
When I get a glass of water, I get charged for that water. When they come on Thursdays to pick up my trash and recycling, I pay for that. I pay a rate for that, a fee for that. So what you're saying is, with the proposal that the city manager and you put to the council recently, with the increase in the property tax rate to the voter approval rate, which will allow us to collect 3.5% more revenue than we had last year, you add that to rates and fees, the typical homeowner would see an increase out of their pocket of $346 a year.
Yes.
Tell me how that breaks down. So in the 346, I get what you just told me about rates, fees, and property taxes, but when a taxpayer pays their property taxes, they're paying for. We've been talking about services and that kind of thing, but those are typically referred to as what, M&O?
Maintenance and operations, M&O, correct. And so when you see your property tax bill and you see that full amount that you pay, it is a mix of maintenance and operations and debt service. Maintenance and operation is where that 3.5% cap is related to. There's another portion of the rate, the tax rate, that is the debt rate. That rate is based on making sure the city is funding the debt or the bond programs that have already been approved by the community. And so when you see that your property tax bill, your M&O goes up about 3.5%, but your debt rate goes up as much as needed to pay for the taxes, or to pay for the projects and programs that have already been approved from debt.
So Austin over the past decade has had multiple bond elections.
Correct.
Everything from transportation to affordable housing, parks. I mean, that's how we fund some of these big projects that are going on.
Yes.
And we fund them by going to the voters, asking for. There are other ways to create debt, but typically it's with having an election, and then we're able to sell those bonds. That gives us the funds to build those things, but we have to pay the folks that are buying the bonds, right? That's the debt part of that. So what you're saying is that when I look at my property tax bill, it has maintenance and operations, and that's what we're budgeting to operate that library and operate those parks and provide that public health. But I also am having to pay the debt on those bond elections.
Right.
So if we were at the no new revenue rate, instead of, if your proposal had been at the no new revenue rate as opposed to the voter approval rate, in other words, same amount of money this year as last year, would the property taxes still go up?
They definitely would still go up
And tell me again why?
because of the debt rate that is included in your tax rate. So the debt rate will go up to make sure there's enough funding to cover those bond repayments that we have to pay. And because of the amount of projects that we've taken on over the last several years, and as we make progress on those projects, we sell those bonds and start paying it back, we'll continue to see that increase. And we're currently anticipating that debt side of the tax rate to increase through 2031.
And that's even if we don't, there's been a lot of talk about whether or not we have a bond election this year. What you just described, that increase until 2031, that's there even if we don't have a bond election this year.
Correct, because that's based on past bonds that have been approved.
So when we're evaluating what we want to do on budgets, and we're thinking about the typical homeowner, or for that matter, all people that are paying property taxes, and we're making these decisions in these economic times, we ought to be factoring in things like bond elections and the impact that that will also have.
Absolutely.
Let's talk about some of the specifics in this budget and some of the programs that are going to be funded if this budget passes. Talk to me a little bit about one or two of the bigger things that this budget is trying to invest in.
I think that's one of the things that the city manager, me and the team are proud of. We try to create a budget that talked to or spoke to the many service needs that we see across the city, whether it's things that we see internally just to make sure we're doing things well as an organization, or making sure that we're addressing the needs that the community have brought up. And so one of the things that has been an ongoing conversation is how are we funding permanent supportive housing? What are the needs around those housing units? And two of our departments help fund those things. So you think about homeless strategies and operations that wraparound services. There's $6 million of investments for wraparound services for permanent supportive housing. In addition, our housing department that is responsible for the local housing vouchers has $7.8 million of investment to make sure we have the vouchers to operate the units, while HSO has the wraparound services to help the people who are in the units.
Got it. Anything else that jumps out at you?
We have invested in our public safety, our fire department. We have $6 million added for their overtime costs to make sure there's enough funding for full-person staffing. Our EMS department needed some additional overtime dollars to make sure they can operate fully during their cadet training programs. We've invested in parks and recreation, making sure the parkland and the pools were maintained. And then even as much as preparing for the reopening of Elizabeth Ney Museum, providing a position to help support the operations of the museum when it reopens next spring.
So while we're seeing cost drivers go up, this proposed budget is also trying to make additional investments as we go along, not just trying to stabilize over the next 5 years.
Right.
Tell me about reserves. How do those work?
So we have a 17% reserve policy, which means that we should have 17% of our funds, our dollars saved so that we can respond to, let me back up. We should have 17% of our operating costs saved so that we can respond to emergencies or economic downturn. And so we keep and we propose a reserves that will end fiscal year 27 at that 17% policy, which will allow us, if needed, to respond again to emergencies. This past year, we used some of that reserves to help us to maintain a balanced budget as we saw the changes of sales tax in particular. And so those reserves are really important to make sure the city is able to continue to maintain services regardless of the environment or the economic downturns or changes that may happen.
Well, great. I appreciate what you do. Not everybody gets to see your work the way I do. And I want you to know how much I appreciate on behalf of all the citizens of the city of Austin. You're a public servant of the highest caliber, and I want to say thank you for that.
Thank you, Mayor. I really
Thank
appreciate that.